EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Many people have gotten money from the federal government to pay for their college educations in exchange for promising to work a set number of years in public service jobs. That could mean teaching in a low-performing school or being a nurse in a high-poverty community hospital. Cory Turner of NPR's education team has spent the past 18 months digging into these programs, including major problems with how some of those loans and grants have been administered. That's caused confusion and heartache for tens of thousands of borrowers. Lawmakers are paying attention to the reporting. Cory, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me, Emily.
We're going to talk about two specific programs. First up is the Teach Grant, and then there's the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. Let's start with the Teach Grant. Give us a little bit of history.
Sure. The Teach Grant program was created to basically encourage promising, aspiring teachers to work in high-need schools right out of college and to teach high-need subjects like math, science, sometimes a foreign language. It depended on the needs of the school and the district. And in return for essentially promising while they're in college that they're going to do this when they graduate, the federal government would give them as much as $4,000 a year in so-called Teach Grants to pay for college. And what we found, though, is that while an awful lot of teachers ended up receiving these Teach Grants, most of them had their grants converted into loans at some point once they graduated. And often it was happening to teachers who were keeping their end of the bargain, but they were being converted because of really complex bureaucratic paperwork requirements.
How many people are we talking about actually that were taking advantage of the Teach Grant?
Believe it or not, it was actually hard to put a number on it at first, but we're certainly talking about tens of thousands. And now at the sort of end of our reporting, the end of our investigating, now that the Ed Department has offered a fix, which is fairly comprehensive, we know that I think the number of teachers who have applied to have their grants given back and been accepted is between 4,000 and 5,000 at this point, with still many more applications yet to be processed.
And how did the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program come into being?
The Public Service Loan Forgiveness, which was created a little more than 10 years ago, it was created in 2007 as a way to entice promising college graduates into traditionally low-paying public service jobs. You know, you have nursing, obviously first responders, but also lots of folks who work for not-for-profits. You get into some university employees, teaching qualified. So there's actually some overlap with the Teach Grant. It's a huge potential pool of applicants.
We want to mention that you and consumer finance reporter Chris Arnold of NPR teamed up on the initial investigation. How did the Teach Grant pop up onto your radar?
It's funny. It all started with a relatively short story we did a year and a half ago when news broke that the administration was working behind the scenes to craft a sort of legal opinion arguing that student loan companies, known inside the industry as servicers, that the department wanted to protect these companies from state lawsuits. Several of these servicers are being sued by a number of state attorneys general for allegedly mishandling large student loan programs, for hurting borrowers. And the administration, it seemed, wanted to figure out how it could essentially shield these companies, who are federal government contractors, from these lawsuits. And Chris needed some help. We teamed up. And it was in the process of doing interviews for that story that one of our sources said, "Oh, by the way, have you heard of this thing called a Teach Grant?" And neither one of us had ever heard of it.
Okay, so you hadn't heard of the Teach Grant, but a lot of beat reporters might be out there listening and saying, hey, we knew about this. This was kind of old news to us. But how did you make it fresh again?
I think anytime you have a story about a federal program that may be hurting the vast majority of people who apply for it and nobody's actually covered it, that's pretty fresh. You know, the fact is people may have heard of Teach Grant, but nobody had any data to say the program's working or the program's not working. And it was that data that we got our hands on that showed, wow, there are real problems with this thing. It doesn't appear to be working. And there was even an internal survey that Ed did of folks in the program who had been jettisoned from the program. And these folks are telling the department, look, we met the requirements and we still lost our grants. And that was the first big red flag for us.
What I think is really remarkable in the reporting is the commonness of that theme. The idea that these are not folks who said, okay, I said I would go teach for X number of years, but actually I'm going to leave the job sooner, but I still don't want to pay this back. This is people who were dotting those I's, crossing those T's, but there may have been just a small blip, a technicality, and that was enough to get them thrown off.
I think, honestly, Emily, the thing that horrifies me about this story, I think may also be the reason so many people ignored it. And that is that there's a big difference for journalists, and maybe there shouldn't be, in stories where something is legal, but it's still wrong, right? And this is the perfect case of a story where everything that was happening was legal. The Ed department kept telling us early on, yes, this is happening. We don't really dispute that, but we're following the law. And Chris and I kept looking at the data and talking to more and more teachers who kept sending us to more and more teachers. And what we keep hearing is this really terrible cycle of teachers who go into this program thinking, all right, I'm going to do this, I'm going to make good. And they do. And then inevitably, each and every one of them ends up getting a letter in the mail saying, well, you didn't keep your half of the bargain. And suddenly you have $16,000 in loans. And it may be legal, but it's wrong.
You've said this wasn't necessarily a case of teachers as victims and the feds as the villains here. What do you mean by that?
Well, so the federal side of this is teachers aren't going to lose their grants if they're returning paperwork on time every year. Our argument was when you look at what the paperwork looks like, how it reads, how it is explained to teachers, when during the calendar year it was often sent to teachers, which is to say during the summer when they're not at work, and how often the federal government and the loan servicing company had incorrect addresses, because keep in mind, these are new teachers who are going straight from college to an apartment, maybe to another apartment, to a house. Like, it was so common for teachers to not even get a paperwork reminder. And so they get caught up in this thing. And I just refuse to accept that, A, that is entirely the fault of the teacher, and that B, it is a fair punishment to say you missed a paperwork deadline, you deserve a $16,000 fee. That just doesn't make sense. Especially not if, this is really important, especially not if the point of the program, the spirit of the program, was to encourage promising young teachers into schools that need them most. The worst thing we could possibly do is say, because of a paperwork mistake, we're going to impose such a fine on you that you're probably going to leave the profession and the school that needs you. It just doesn't make sense.
By anybody's standards, this story blew up. I mean, social media, comments on NPR's website, emails and calls to you. But how quickly did it become clear that yours and Chris's reporting was gaining traction among the people who might actually have some leverage to address the problem?
I think we had gotten a sense fairly early on from the department that they were listening. I think they were mostly surprised by the failure rates of the program. Compared to lots of other programs that the education department administers, Teach Grant is relatively small, even though it affects the lives of tens of thousands of teachers. So I think the department was surprised at first. They listened. And then we ended up going through this sort of back and forth where we realized doing anything about it was a really interesting process question. Does it require Congress? Can the department just do it? Can it do a fix without rewriting the rules entirely? And this became a sort of back and forth between us and the department trying to understand, what can you do to make the changes that will be meaningful to teachers, and not just a couple cosmetic things that make it look like you're helping, but you're not really.
And that's actually happened, hasn't it?
Yeah. So I still remember I was on a date night with my wife when we first got the document that outlined everything the department was finally willing to do moving forward. I just got it on my phone and I was reading it and I was at the table with my wife and I just told her, I said, I'm really sorry. I got to call Chris because I can't believe this. And I called Chris for 10 minutes on my date night because he and I were both surprised at how far ultimately the department was willing to go. I mean, as I said earlier, this reconversion process has now helped. Last time I checked, it was well over 4,000 teachers. I assume we're close to not past 5,000 teachers now. And the great thing is I get emails from them every single day now. Thank you notes from people I've never met, sharing their story and saying, I got my 5,000 back, or I just had $15,000 taken off of my student debt total. I know it has helped thousands of people, and that feels great.
I'm sure it does. I want to turn to the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. And clearly, there were problems in how this program was being managed, some similar themes to what we've heard about lack of accountability or mismanagement. And so you have the borrowers, and then you have the lender, who is the feds. But in the middle, you've got the loan servicers. And Congress decided last year that there really were some problems here with how these loans were being administered. What was the fix that Congress approved?
Yeah, so this is really hard because there are essentially two big reasons. I mean, there are many reasons, but two big reasons, if I'm going to be reductive here, that borrowers are being denied public service loan forgiveness. One of them is they had the wrong kind of loan. And that's because when this program first started, the bulk of loans at the time were what were called FEL loans. And it was only a few years later, in the heart of the Obama administration, that the federal direct loan program became essentially the big daddy. So the folks early on, most of them have FEL loans. Those don't count. You can't get public service loan forgiveness with a FEL loan. And then the other reason folks are denied is because they're in the wrong repayment program. You have to be in an income-driven repayment program. And lots of folks early on, they would ask their loan servicer, what do I need to do? Am I on track? And for a number of reasons, many of them were told, oh yeah, you're good, but they were maybe in an extended repayment program or a graduated repayment program. And so what Congress did last year is they set aside a pot of money, $700 million, and they didn't think they could afford to help both of these groups, so they helped one. They helped the folks who were in the wrong repayment plan. But to this day, if you had a FEL loan, you have no recourse.
Okay, gotta ask the question. I know the answer, but gotta ask it, Cory. What percentage of people got the help? Setting you up here. Lay it on us.
Well, unfortunately, this is really easy. Whether you're talking about public service loan forgiveness or Congress's temporary fix last year, both programs have denied 99% of applicants, which is pretty astonishing. It was a little less surprising for the original program because we all knew it was problematic. But for the congressional expansion, the 99% really took my breath away.
So you were the first to get a look at a Government Accountability Office report looking at this fix from Congress, taking stock, saying, how are we doing so far? What did the GAO determine?
For me, the headline from the GAO report, besides the fact that this fix is denying 99% of applicants, is that roughly 2/3 of those denials aren't based on substance at all. In fact, 2/3 of those denials, those people aren't even really being denied. They're being turned away because they didn't fill out the right form, which, again, took my breath away. It was really strange. I had to read it a couple times to understand exactly what it was saying, but they were being denied because they hadn't officially applied for and then been denied public service loan forgiveness, which is the original program. And because of the sort of bureaucracy at the Ed Department, folks were required to apply for and be denied that program before they could then apply officially for the fix. And lots of borrowers I spoke with, they thought, sure, they had already applied for and been denied. And it turns out they hadn't filled out the form the department wanted them to fill out.
We want to be careful here again not to paint people as victims or villains. What has the Department of Education's response been to this audit?
In their response to the GAO report, they accepted all of GAO's recommendations. There is an acknowledgement from the department that TEPSLF, as it's called, has not gone smoothly. I don't think anyone is willing to argue that it has. Where the debate is really the education department wants to be clear that Congress created this fix and gave the Ed Department, I believe it was 60 days to basically figure it out. And the ed department says in its defense, it's really hard to do something this complicated in 60 days. So we had to require borrowers to do something. And our systems and our forms only allowed us to do basically what we ended up doing. And if you don't like it, then, maybe Congress, you need to go back and make changes. So the ed department is saying, look, we did the best we could under the circumstances that you, Congress, gave us.
So they're asking for either different parameters to work under, or maybe Congress is going to have to be more direct in its guidance.
Yeah, I suppose either.
We're talking with Cory Turner of NPR's education team about student loan debt and the trouble some borrowers are having with federal programs. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And if there's a story you want to know more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. Cory, I want to talk not just about what your reporting uncovered, but how you did it. I'm sure that's a question you've been getting from other reporters. What do they want to know?
I think, especially with the Teach investigation, because that has had an arc, obviously PSLF, we're still right in the middle of it. And it's hard to know what will happen with PSLF. It is such an enormous program, and many of the problems at this point feel really intractable. Sometimes with PSLF, I feel like we're trying to unmake an omelet, and I don't know how to do that. But with Teach Grant, I've said this in a panel or two before. I really think it's important for reporters when they're looking for stories to not just look for the stuff that really stands out, the stuff that's blatantly illegal, corruption, the toxicity of Washington. I mean, a lot of the mistakes that our government makes these days aren't because of bad actors. I mean, yes, of course there are bad actors, and of course there are bad things happening, even on our beat. But I feel like a lot of people are being hurt by bureaucracy, by inefficiencies in our system, by, a sort of pecking order in government that makes it hard for people who see that something is wrong to speak out and say, well, wait a minute, I don't think this is working. And that's essentially what we did with Teach, is we took a thing that people weren't really paying attention to, that they didn't really take seriously, because technically everybody was following the rules. And we said, yeah, but this doesn't make sense, and it's not right. And, ultimately everybody, including the department, agreed with us.
How much of this reporting was drawn from public records requests?
That's a complicated question to answer, because some of our reporting was done in partnership with an organization called Public Citizen. And it turns out that one of their attorneys had been looking into Teach Grant in isolation. We didn't know it. And then we were looking into Teach Grant. And so after our first story ran, she reached out to us and said, hey, you just did this big story on this thing that I'm really interested in too. And I think I've got some documents coming my way, and I'm happy to share them. And so some of what we learned in that collaboration with Public Citizen. Some of what we learned through documents that we got on our own. It was also sort of the ideal for a reporter. Once we started reporting on the project and more people heard it, then we started getting documents from lots of other people, internal sources at the department, internal sources in Congress. There were lots of different places. Once we were a year in, there were lots of different places these documents were coming from.
Have there been any technological developments in the past couple of years that have changed the way that you report? I mean, I know for me personally, having a reliable voice recorder on my phone has made a big difference in how I do my interviews. What about something like encrypted messaging?
Yes, I use Signal, and it was definitely helpful in this story. I had some pretty long Signal threads. Just leave it at that.
Absolutely. Well, what advice do you have for reporters trying to make time for these kinds of long-term investigations? They require a lot of patience, not just on their part, but often on the part of their editors.
I guess I should take this opportunity to thank my editor, Steve Drummond, and NPR, really, because I know there are a lot of outlets where if a reporter said the story is going to take me a year and a half, the answer would probably be no. And I'll be honest, we didn't know what we had in the Teach Grant investigation until we were many months into it. The data we got a first look at that we reported in that very first story was about as muddy and ugly as it gets. And it was not what you would call a smoking gun. it was really worrisome. And we knew anecdotally that there were a lot of teachers whose experiences seemed to line up, but we did not have a clear case to take to our editor and his boss and her boss to say, this is worth taking not only Cory off the ed beat, but Chris off the consumer finance beat for a year and a half. Although I will be clear, I worked on an entire season of a parenting podcast with Sesame Workshop at the same time I'm doing this investigation. So there was a lot of juggling too.
Cory, may you never not have enough time for Cookie Monster.
It is funny that my Cookie Monster interview dropped at roughly the same time we were dropping this big Teach investigation. That warms my heart.
One of my favorites of the year, without question. What are some examples of some other federal education programs reporters should maybe take a fresh look at, even if it isn't necessarily, like you say, mired in scandal right now?
Well, the interesting thing about this is even with public service loan forgiveness, when we talk about scandal, we always think, well, scandal is malfeasance and scandal is corruption. And I feel like so much of the story of our current student loan industry is not malfeasance or corruption necessarily. It's what happens when you don't have a lot of actors trying to create a system that is going to serve tens of millions of borrowers. It is just going to get nasty. And sometimes that nastiness is going to create a pattern within one program, as it did with Teach, as it clearly has with PSLF. And it's in those patterns, I think, that great, great stories are born, great stories that can become really important public service. That's where I would look.
But, I got to say, what really stuck with me when I was preparing for this conversation with you, and I listened to some other reporters' work around this, and I listened to the 1A program, also on NPR, and Joshua Johnson was looking at the crushing load of student loan debt. And he asked one of his guests an interesting question, which is all debt bad? Is debt always a bad thing? And, I remember taking out my first car loan for my very first new car, and my dad saying to me, make sure this is the car you really want, because when you make that payment every month, you've got to love that car. And we're talking now about folks who weren't looking for something for free. They were willing to make those monthly payments in exchange for something of value to them and arguably of value to society. And so I do think this is a really important story, and I hope our journalist members will think about some ways to localize it.
Yeah, actually, Emily, this is such an important point. Whenever I do a public service loan forgiveness story, and even this was true with the first couple of stories I did in Teach Grant, there's always a wave of counter criticism of me and of my sources that basically argues, stop whining, shut up, just pay your loans like everybody else. And I want to be really, really clear without sounding like I'm getting on a soapbox, even though I'm absolutely getting on a soapbox. This story is important. Both of these stories are important because these were commitments. These are not people looking for a free ride. These are people who agreed to do a public service. And at the time they agreed to do it, our government said, in return, we will do this and this and this for you. This was a compact. And that's why this matters, because our democracy is built on trust in government. And I have talked with so many borrowers who feel really bitterly betrayed at this point because they feel like that promise wasn't kept. That's important. And they're not freeloaders, and they're not whiners, and they're not looking for a free ride.
Cory Turner reports and edits for the NPR education team. He also co-hosts NPR's Life Kit Parenting podcast. Cory, thanks for making time for EWA Radio.
Well, thank you for having me, Emily. I appreciate you.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to know more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.